Okay, for today's lesson, we're going to be discussing how to read a poem out loud. The reason we're looking at this is it's connected to the poetry unit we're doing right now. Um, and this week we're looking at performance poetry, and so we want to discuss what is essential in reading a poem out loud. Okay, so the essential question for today's lesson: how can I correctly and accurately read a poem out loud? If I have a poem in front of me, whether I wrote it or someone else wrote it, how can I accurately read it? Okay, a common mistake that happens when people read poetry out loud, especially poetry they did not write, okay, so they're performing someone else's poetry, is that they pause at the end of each line rather than pausing correctly with the punctuation. Another example of this, where this happens very, very often, is in works such as Shakespeare, because his plays were written essentially extended poetry, and so people tend to pause at the end of the line because there's a natural break there, and our brains are trained to pause and move on to the next line. However, there is no punctuation there, and so we should continue reading out loud. Okay? Um, so the poetic concept we're going to be looking at, which is directly related to this, is enjambment. I know it's a funny looking word, enjambment. And what is enjambment? Okay, and this is when the meaning runs over from one poetic line to the next without terminal punctuation. Okay, so there's no punctuation, there's no comma, there's no semicolon, there's no period at the end of the line, and the meaning carries over from one line to the next. Okay, so what is the effect of enjambment in a poem? Um, like we said, there's a pause that happens in your brain just because of the way we read, where we stop at the end of the line and we move down to the next line. Okay, and this creates a tension which is produced by that visual pause. Okay, and that tension kind of makes your brain stop and think. Okay, and there's two things that can happen with that. It can either add visual emphasis to the word that's at the end of that line, or it can add visual emphasis to the word that's at the beginning of the next line, which is called the rejet. Okay, another effect that can happen, and you'll see this often in Shakespeare, is that it can help soften the rhymes that are within the poem, and it can keep those poems essentially from feeling less rhymey, if that makes sense. It sounds less like a little children's rhyme, and it actually makes the rhyme feel like it's an internal rhyme as opposed to an end of each line. Okay, so let's look at Shakespeare since we mentioned him. And this is from Midsummer Night's Dream, Puck's monologue at the end of the play. If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear. Okay, the third line is enjambed. You see there's no period, no comma, no semicolon. And so with that enjambment, when I read it out loud, I didn't pause there. Okay, so I read it essentially as if you see below where I've written it out, almost like prose. I've taken the line breaks out. Okay, so if you want to talk about what the effect is, I think in this particular case, it's not to bring emphasis to the word here or while, as those words have kind of little connotative meaning, but rather it's to help Puck's monologue and speech feel more like actual colloquial speech. Although if you look at the entire monologue, there is a lot of rhyme and it is very poetic. However, it sounds more like someone actually speaking. It kind of mimics human speech. So by having that third line in jam, that helps create that effect.